policy.
Morning. Government policy.
Government sanctions.
Government sanctions. Government sanctions. Government sanctions. Money policy.
Sanctions.
Sanctions policy. Sanctions policy.
Morning.
Money. Sanctions.
Morning.
Sanctions policy. Sanctions. Government sanctions.
Morning.
Sanctions policy. Sanctions policy. Sanctions policy. Sanctions.
Morning.
Government sanctions policy. Sanctions policy. Sanctions.
Morning.
Money.
Sanctions. Government sanctions government policy. Sanctions. Government policy. Government money. Government sanctions policy. Money. Government sanctions. Government policy. Sanctions. Government sanctions.
Morning.
Sanctions.
Policy. Morning.
Morning.
Money.
Morning. Government.
Morning.
Government.
Morning.